In the shadowed corridors of history, entire civilizations have risen and fallen without ever hearing the footfalls of their own demise. Imagine standing in a bustling forum where marble gleams under the Mediterranean sun, merchants hawk spices from distant lands, and senators debate the eternal glory of Rome, utterly convinced that their world would endure forever. Yet within generations, that same empire would crumble into ruins overgrown with ivy, its aqueducts silent, its legions scattered like dust in the wind. This is the story of societies that didn't know they were ending, a silent procession of collapses that reshaped humanity not with sudden cataclysm, but through the slow, unnoticed erosion of what once seemed unbreakable. The air thick with denial, the streets alive with routine, no one saw the fracture lines spreading beneath their feet. The Roman Empire at its height, in the 2nd century AD, embodied this illusion of permanence. Citizens awoke to the sounds of chariot wheels on cobblestone, the cries of street vendors, and the distant chants from temples dedicated to gods who had favored them for centuries. Daily life unfolded in a rhythm of baths, markets, and public spectacles, where bread and circuses kept the masses content, and the elite secure in their villas adorned with frescoes of eternal triumphs. Trade routes stretched from Britain to Arabia, carrying grain, silk, and gold, while legions guarded borders that seemed as immutable as the Alps. Families gathered for meals under oil lamps, discussing philosophy and law, blind to the subtle shifts in climate, the gradual depopulation of farmlands, and the influx of migrants fleeing their own troubled lands. It was a golden age that felt destined to last millennia, its architecture and bureaucracy a testament to human ingenuity that no force could dismantle. Yet early warning signs flickered like distant lightning on the horizon, invisible to those immersed in the present. Inflation gnawed at the currency as emperors debased coins to fund endless campaigns, their silver content dwindling while prices soared unnoticed in the daily haggling of forums. Soil exhaustion in provinces turned fertile fields into dust bowls, harvests thinned, and tax burdens grew heavier on a shrinking population, plagued by intermittent plagues that carried away laborers and soldiers alike. Corruption seeped into the administration, with governors enriching themselves while infrastructure crumbled in remote areas. Intellectuals wrote treatises on virtue and governance, but few connected these threads into a tapestry of vulnerability. The empire's vastness, once its strength, now masked the fractures, as borders strained under pressure from nomadic tribes, whose movements were dismissed as mere barbarian raids, rather than harbingers of systemic strain. No one understood what was coming next. As the 3rd and 4th centuries unfolded, rising tension transformed quiet unease into open instability. Civil wars erupted with alarming frequency, rival claimants to the throne tearing the military apart in bloody contests that drained treasuries and loyalty. Economic networks frayed as trade caravans faced increasing banditry and piracy, while urban centers swelled with displaced rural folk seeking refuge from failing farms. Emperors like Diocletian attempted reforms, splitting the empire and imposing rigid controls, but these measures only postponed the inevitable by further entrenching division. The Huns' westward push displaced the Goths, who in turn pressed against Roman frontiers, their desperation met with inconsistent policies of integration and rejection. Daily life began to change imperceptibly at first. Markets grew sparse, public works halted, and the once reliable grain dole faltered, breeding resentment in the streets where breadlines formed under graying skies. The ruling classes debated theology and succession, while the foundations of order quietly dissolved. Key decisions sealed the path toward rupture. The division of the empire into East and West created rival power centers that competed, rather than cooperated, weakening mutual defense. Heavy taxation to sustain oversized armies alienated the very farmers and merchants who sustained the state, prompting many to abandon their lands or seek protection under local strongmen. Alliances with barbarian groups backfired as federated troops turned against their hosts, their loyalty purchased with land and gold that further fragmented authority. Environmental pressures compounded human errors. Prolonged droughts and cooler temperatures reduced agricultural yields across Europe, while pandemics like the plague of Justinian decimated populations already stretched thin. Leaders clung to the rhetoric of restoration, rebuilding temples and issuing edicts, but these gestures masked a profound inability to adapt to a world that was fundamentally changing. The pressure mounted like a vice. squeezing the life from institutions built for a different era. The moment the system began to fail arrived not with a single dramatic sack, but through cascading breakdowns that unfolded over decades. In 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric breached the gates of Rome itself, an event that sent shockwaves through the Mediterranean world, yet many chroniclers still framed it as a temporary setback. Supply lines collapsed, cities lost contact with the center, and coinage ceased to circulate reliably as local economies reverted to barter. Aqueducts fell into disrepair, baths emptied, and forums grew silent except for the wind whistling through colonnades. The Western Empire's last emperors became puppets in Ravenna, their authority evaporating as provinces declared autonomy or fell to invaders. By the time the final emperor was deposed in 476 AD, the collapse felt almost administrative, a quiet administrative footnote rather than the end of an age. The collapse did not begin with chaos, it began quietly, in the unnoticed accumulation of unresolved crises. Human consequences rippled through every layer of society, turning neighbors into strangers, and routines into struggles for survival. Urban populations dwindled as people fled to the countryside, forming self-sufficient villages under the protection of local lords, the seeds of feudalism taking root amid the ruins. Knowledge faded as libraries burned or were abandoned, literacy rates plummeted, and artistic traditions simplified into cruder forms. Famine stalked the land, diseases spread unchecked through weakened populations, and violence became commonplace as warlords carved out territories. Families that once celebrated triumphs now mourned lost sons and dwindling harvests, their fears amplified by the silence of absent imperial messengers. Social bonds frayed, trust eroded, and a once cosmopolitan world fragmented into isolated pockets where memory of Rome lingered like a ghost in half-forgotten ruins. The psychological toll was immense. Generations raised in decline normalized scarcity, their aspirations shrinking to mere endurance. The long-term historical impact of such unaware endings echoes across centuries, reshaping the map of Europe and beyond. The fall of Rome created a power vacuum that birthed medieval kingdoms, preserved fragments of classical learning in monasteries, and set the stage for the Renaissance rediscovery of antiquity. Trade routes realigned. Christianity spread as a unifying force amid fragmentation, and technological adaptations emerged from necessity, like improved plows for harsher soils. Yet the rupture also meant centuries of reduced complexity, with population declines and lost engineering skills delaying recovery. Similar patterns repeated elsewhere. The Maya city-states of Central America, thriving with intricate calendars and towering pyramids around 800 AD, saw their societies unravel through overpopulation, deforestation, and prolonged droughts that their rulers failed to fully grasp, until reservoirs ran dry and monuments stood empty. Easter Island's inhabitants, famous for their colossal moai statues, depleted their forests in rituals and rivalries, leading to soil erosion and societal implosion long before European contact. Each case reveals how interconnected systems, ecological, economic, political, can fail when leaders and citizens alike mistake temporary resilience for eternal stability. By examining these societies that didn't know they were ending, we confront the uncomfortable truth that civilizations often perceive their decline only in retrospect. Through the lens of survivors sifting through rubble, the air grows heavy with the weight of forgotten ambitions, the silence of abandoned forums speaking louder than any chronicle. What routines sustain us today might one day be viewed with the same poignant detachment. Markets humming, lights blazing, institutions humming along, while invisible currents gather force beneath the surface. The lesson lingers not in fear, but in vigilance. The great collapses of history were not announced by trumpets, but by the slow fading of lights no one thought to relight. In the end, the ruins stand as quiet witnesses, reminding future generations that every age carries within it the seeds of its own transformation, whether recognized in time or allowed to bloom into irreversible rupture. The wheel turns, civilizations rise and fall, and the human story continues in the spaces they leave behind, forever haunted by what might have been, if only the warnings had been heeded before it was already too late.